Okay, we're dealing in our second unit. The second unit is the rabbis and Noahide, or Noahides and rabbis. Um, our purpose here, of course, our end result purpose is going to be to discuss how Noahides should choose a rabbi, what kind of rabbi is qualified. And in order to do that, we did one thing less. The first part of what we did was we discussed the concept of rabbinic authority, where it comes from, from the Bible, Parshas in Exodus, where it talks about setting up judges. And we showed how in the biblical text, the judges have a very wide range of areas in which they can judge on, and that we're supposed to follow them. And basically the system. Last month, we did the first part of what we're doing, which is history and a little bit more than that. We're tracing the tradition of what is somewhat called law. Somebody, Dan, do you want to mute people because it's sort of called the oral law. How it goes from the beginning from Moshe all the way to today. Now, last time we got down to about the 11th century. Today, I hope to get down to the 16th century, so another 500 years. First one was a little more. Essentially, let's do what last time in a nutshell what was going on. We followed from Moshe until the destruction of the first temple, when the Jewish people went into exile in Babylonia, where we see authority going from generation to generation, from time from Moshe to Joshua, from Joshua to the elders, from the elders to prophets, and going all the way until the temple was destroyed, with the last few prophets, Malachi, Haggai, who were in the exile in Babylonia, lived. There they had a group which we call the Men of the Great Assembly. They put together things like they put the Tanakh together. These were individual books, but they decided which books we would consider the Tanakh. As Josephus says, not everybody's allowed to write a book. From there, we take it from the time of the Babylonian exile all the way down to the destruction, from generation to generation, starting with Shimon HaTzadik, who was there in Babylonia, and from generation to generation all the way down to the leaders who were specifically actually in the land of Israel, Holy Land, all the way down through Hillel to the destruction of the Second Temple. From the Jerusalem, where it had been there, it moved to a different city, Yavne, still continue a central location for authority, continued until the time of Yehuda Hanassi, which is the late 2nd century, where he compiled together the Mishnah, which is a collection basically of final decisions or teachings from different rabbis, and collected them in one place in order so that they shouldn't be lost, because Rome was moving at that time away from a stable empire as it was to a 100+ year time of total instability. If you look at history, you'll find that the 3rd century in Rome was a time of instability. I don't remember how many emperors they had, but I think they managed. They had like one every few years, averaging. It was a time of again, total instability. And of course, instability makes it difficult to keep the level of learning the way it was. So we see that for that reason, the Mishnah was written. And for that reason, the rabbis from the Mishnah are different from the rabbis after the Mishnah, because they did not have the political, social situation in order to concentrate the same way as the rabbis before them. So they were on a lower level. After the Mishnah, we see also a rise of something else. The rabbis in the Talmud will be also from Babylonia. So the center of Torah learning is moving east to Babylonia, which was under the Persian Empire. Well, I should probably use Persian instead, but for some reason we call it Babylonian, because the Talmud's called the Babylonian Talmud instead of the Persian Talmud, even though it was under Persia. So the center of Torah learning moves towards Babylonia in this period of time, talking after the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century. By the 5th century is when the Babylonian Talmud was completed, and by that time the transfer has gone completely to Babylonia, because in the Holy Land, what's going on is the Byzantine Church had taken over, and there was considerable amount of persecution of Jews living there. considerable amount of restrictions in religion and stuff like that, which made it much more difficult for the community to maintain what they did. Whereas in Babylonia, with the closing of the Talmud, things were different. There was a couple hundred years we called the Rabbinus Havaroi, which they took the Talmud and they formatted in the way we do. If you open up a Talmud today, you'll see it says Mishnah, it says Mishnah.
That's where we
It'll say Mishnah, for example, and then the Talmud, you see two dots in different places, and sometimes a few words, introducing a few words from the Mishnah, and then the Talmud. They formatted it in such a way that it was much more easier. They didn't really add, but they just formatted in a way that made the learning of Talmud much more easier to do. Okay, that brings it up to the period starting about the 7th century, early 7th century, which is the time of the Goinim. From the 7th century until the 11th century was the time of the Goinim, generation of generation. I mentioned a few important ones last month, but essentially what it is, we're seeing from generation in Babylonia, there were two main yeshivas in Sura and Babadisa, and these two yeshivas were the centers of Torah learning, even though there were far-flung communities in different places. For example, Charlemagne brought from Italy, which was under his domain of the empire, he brought the Colonimus family to the city of Mainz, settled them there, and that settled that as a Torah community. There were communities in Spain, North Africa, and various different places where there were communities, all these communities, but the central authority was actually in Babylonia. Okay? In the 11th century, what happened was there was an invasion in the east of the Seljuk Turks. Unlike the earlier changes when it went from Persian to the Muslim rule, then the Mongol invasions also. With this happened, there was not as much of a disruption. But with the Seljuk Turks, we see that there was a disruption of the political situation, and basically the Babylonian Jewish community and the power that they had fell. In its place, what we have now, which is a step towards where we're now, there was a split between two primary communities. The community under the Christians, which is basically, we call it Germany, or we call them in Hebrew Ashkenaz, which means Germany, because the main centers there at the beginning were in Germany, in Mainz, Wem, and Speyer, were the main centers there. Although we see also in France, Rashi, we'll talk about, was in France. So the general area is called Ashkenaz, and that was one center of Torah learning. Again, not the types of yeshivas in Babylonia, a little bit more dispersed, but still that was one center where you could talk about it basically as a unit. The other was based around Spain and North Africa, and also the Islamic countries, which were not as strong. Like, for example, in the Holy Land, we know that there was activity in learning. For example, the Masoretes were in the 10th, 11th century. They lived in Israel, in Tiberia, and other places like that. We know that there was activity going on, but it wasn't on the high level of learning that, for example, was in Babylonia, where it was a center, and as we will find in Europe and in the Sephardic lands, which Sephard means Spain. Okay, so we see a split coming about, which this is the begin of what we have now, where we have Jews who are Ashkenazim and Jews that are Sephardim. That split happened because the Jews who were in Christian countries in Germany were Ashkenazim, and the Jews that were in Sephardic, in Islamic countries, Spain specifically, North Africa, they were called Sephardim. And that's where the split comes about, because of political situations going on. So today what we're going to cover is, after the Goinim, the first period is called the Rishonim. Rishonim mean the first ones. It covers a period from approximately 1040 to 1440. We're talking about a period of 400 years. And fundamentally, the Rishonim are qualitatively different and on a higher level than the Achronim. It's very difficult to explain when we talk about quality. The commentaries on the Talmud from people we're going to hear about, like the Ritva and stuff like that, people I love, Rashi, are fundamentally different, and the issues that they're dealing with are fundamentally different. The Rishonim deal with what is the meaning of the text, how we're supposed to understand it. And in a sense, that becomes very important for us when it comes to Noahide laws, for example, because Noahide laws are based on conclusions within the Talmud, saying Tractate Sanhedrin and other places where it comes up. And so the views of how we're supposed to understand it, the Talmud commentaries from the Rishonim become important, because once we know what the final law is, how we're supposed to understand that is where the commentaries come in and explain what it's about, what the bases are. That's how we build up to understand how halacha is. And we're going to talk about this as we go along. But again, this is the halachic tradition that comes down to those today who are teaching the Noahide laws. It's people aren't just coming, oh, I'm going to read the Talmud and do it. There's a halachic tradition. There's something that's going on here. And it's very important that when you do choose a rabbi to work with, that this rabbi is aware of it and is actually following within his tradition, sees himself as just a part of that, rather than somebody who's coming out teaching new things and being really a leader of Noahides and stuff like that. Rather than seeing himself as somebody who's just a conduit bringing down what is already there that the previous generations have taught, just relating that. So let's go on. We're going to first start in the Sephardic lands. Now, as we talk, I'm going to bring in things that are going politically and socially in these areas, because it's very important to understand. We're going to find that this period of Rishonim is unit because certain political and sociological things were happening that allowed people to learn a certain level, and then something changed both in Europe and in Sephardic lands, that it was no longer the same, and that starts the beginning of the Chronim. Okay, so that's why I'm not doing this because it's a nice history lesson for Noahides and it's a break from your heavy the kind of lectures you get that are very heavy into religion and stuff like that. No, it's because we're trying to get to the point to understand. Okay, when you're speaking to a rabbi, the rabbis are basically part of a chain going back, and so when somebody who's a learned person like Rabbi Weiner, Blumenstiel, myself, they're talking because they've looked at these sources, they understand what's going on, and they're following certain principles and giving answers rather than just shooting from the hip, which sadly enough, there's a lot of people who do that also, very sincere people whose names I will not mention, who deal with Noahides very sincere, just shoot from the hip saying, hey, listen, whatever. So we're going to get more into some of these details. I just want you to get a feel of what's going on, because this is what Judaism is. This is what the Torah is. It's a tradition. And while the Noahides is not Judaism, the Noahides are following what the Torah is. And the Torah has a relationship to everybody in the world, just like the Tanakh has a relationship to everybody in the world. It's just for the Noahide, it's different than for the Jew. Talk about the Torah and the Noahides in the Torah. We'll talk about those kinds of issues also. So let's go on. Now, we're going to deal with the Sephardic lands first, because that's pretty simple historically. And sadly enough, the Sephardic lands went through a lot of change and a lot of difficulties. In some ways much worse than in Europe, even though we're more aware of the European stuff. So in the Sephardic lands, let's deal first with North Africa, because the first major figure that we need is from North Africa. Now, North Africa was taken over by the Muslims very quickly. They came into Spain, conquered Spain. If you know your history, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't know your history, I'm very capsulizing it very, very, very shortly. Okay, the Muslims conquered Spain. They went into Europe, southern France. There was a battle, I believe, in Poitiers with Charles Martel, who somewhere around 713, 714 defeated the Muslim invaders and stopped Islam from going into Europe. From that time on, there was a continual pushback of the Muslims, first back into Spain, and eventually, by the end of the 15th century, out of Spain. This is sometimes called the Reconquista, but at the time, it was actually called a crusade. Now, many people don't know that the Crusades were actually not a land grab, but an attempt to take back land that was taken by Muslim invaders from, what's now Arabia, Arab invaders who took over lands in Spain and also in what's the Holy Land from the Byzantine Empire. Much of the wars, there were wars between the Byzantines and the Arabs, and eventually the European, the Latin church came and helped, and that was what the crusade was, to actually recover this land back for the Byzantine Empire, but they set up their own kingdoms there and whatever. But that's a different story. This was a crusade. The other crusade that was going on was in the Iberian Peninsula. We call it the Reconquista. We don't use the crusade because I think it's more political than otherwise, because then you know what the Crusades were. But the church at the time was actually pushing both as the same thing. So if you wanted to become a crusader, you had a choice. You can go to the Holy Land, or you could go to the Iberian Peninsula and fight the Muslims there and push them. Okay? So during this period of time, we see a constant pushing back of the Muslims in Spain, and that has a very significant effect on Jewish learning and the spread of Jewish learning and the nature of what was going on in Spain. Okay. Now in North Africa was under the Muslims. The most important and significant event that should be known is in the 12th century, one group of Muslims controlled Morocco, Northern Africa, and then took over Spain. They were called the Almohads. Excuse me if my pronunciation is not Almohads. They were fanatical Muslims in the sense that, while in all Muslim lands there was persecution and degradation of the non-Muslim population, to the point that, well, it may not have been actual forced conversions, but the situation was basically, we're going to persecute you, you're going to be taxed and stuff like that. But if you convert, all that stuff goes away. Okay, that's how Islam became the religion of a lot of people who've been ex-Christians, German, Greeks, and even many Jews converted to Islam because of that. Okay, so there was persecution, and part of the persecution led to there not being great Torah centers of learning in the Holy Land at that time. Now, in North Africa, the development of North Africa was, for a very short amount of time, a vibrant center, an important center. During the last years of the Gaonim, there were two important figures living in North Africa who are a chain, again, in the traditions that become the traditions of the Sephardim. One is Rabbi Hananel and the other is Rabbi Nissim. Both of them wrote Talmud commentaries. Rabbi Hananel was from 993 to 1040, and Rabbi Nissim was 990 to 1062, basically contemporaries. They have they comment on the Talmud. The commentaries are very much like other Rishonim. Very succinct. Rabbi Hananel is on Tractate Bruchos, for example. It's on the side of Tractate Bruchos, you can find it. And some of his other, you can actually buy them nowadays. So you can get a lot of things you couldn't get one time. It's very easy to get books like that. And very nice, succinct commentary on the Talmud. But the third figure, who lived from 1013 to 1103, is called the Rif. That's Rabbi Yitzchak Al-Fasi. Al-Fasi means Al, from, Fasi means from Fez. So he hailed from Morocco. Okay? And what he wrote is, at the time, it was not allowed to print the Talmud, to make the Talmud. So what he did is he went through the Talmud. He excerpt from the Talmud the final legal decisions of every issue that's being discussed, all the non-legal material he left aside, but the legal stuff that was up, and put it together, piled together, and that's called the Rif on the Talmud. And so if you go in the Talmud, if you look afterwards, you can see where he brings out what the final conclusions were of the halacha. So you know what it is. That's an important work. We're going to find some people later on actually have commentaries on it. When one learns specifically for halacha, you learn from the Talmud a passage, say Sanhedrin, and you want to find what the halacha is, you look into sources like the Rif and the commentaries on the Rif, and other sources which we're going to start coming up with, as we go on. And that's where you start discerning final decisions and what actually the final decision means and how that actually is supposed to be used. Now, as we mentioned, the Rif lived until 1103. The Almohads came into power in the 12th century. And when they came into the 12th century, basically the Northern African Jewish community collapsed as a center of Torah. Again, there's always people who are teaching Torah, they're always Torah learning, but the level of Torah that there was such that whatever, there were people there who were learned, but they weren't producing the kinds of works which became part of the halacha process, halachic tradition. They were there. There were people from generation to generation, as were in the Holy Land, but there wasn't that. The Torah learning, the sense of Torah learning were in other places. At this time, it was in Spain, first starting in Muslim Spain, and then it started going into Christian Spain. So besides the Almohads, who, by the way, they in 1148, they were involved in forced conversions of Jews living in Spain, which basically led to the end of Jewish learning under the Muslims in Spain. That was in 1148. But there are a couple other events which occurred on the Spanish Peninsula as the Reconquista was going on that had some serious effects. And these start in the 14th century, because starting in the 14th century, the late 14th century, the Jewish communities there start going into a significant decline. Before that, there was persecutions, there were forced debates, the Catholic Church had forced that people should listen to sermons to convert people to Christianity. This was going on there, but still the level of it was not to such that it was a serious problem to the community. Okay, from the end of the 14th century on to the next 100 or so years, the community was basically in a severe decline. Now, there were two events significantly bringing to that. The first one is in 1369 to 70, there was a Spanish Civil War. What happened, there was a war over the succession to the throne, I believe of the throne of Aragon, between two brothers. This led to a fight amongst them. It was a very big civil war, and many of the Jews, supported the wrong person. He was defeated. There were thousands of Jews who were killed, and basically the communities went through some very serious times at that time. But even worse, and as a sign of the bad things to come, in 1391, a priest with blessings of the church went around to cities in Spain, forcing conversions to Christianity and having pogroms. It's in 1391. It's very, very famous. There's actually a book written about it, discussing about how what happened there. This starts what we call the Marranos, Jews who, because of being told to convert or die, outwardly would convert to try and keep Judaism quietly. The Jewish community tried to support them. And this led to the situation with the Marranos, where they were rooted out and persecuted and stuff like that. But this was basically leading to the downfall of the whole Spanish community until basically in 1492 in Spain. It was united when the last Muslim kingdom of Granada was conquered by Ferdinand and Isabella. Their marriage together brought together Spain. Portugal was a separate country, but Spain basically gave a decree, the Alhambra decree, that Jews had to leave in 1492. And 4 years later, the King of Portugal did the same thing. So the Iberian Peninsula was free of Jews completely by the year 1500. And we'll talk where the Jews went to then, because we see that the center of Torah learning for Sephardic Jews actually moves itself somewhere else. And that, of course, is the ending of the Rishonim in Sfard. Now, when we get to Ashkenaz, we'll talk about what's happening historically in Christian lands, which will take much more time because it was much more varied and much more consistent, the persecutions. So let's go into Sephardic lands. And again, I'm going to mention only the main rabbis who have an important, as far as historically, in either Talmud learning Jewish law, which will have a direct or indirect on Noahide law. And I will throw in some names that may not necessarily, but are of historical importance to know who they were. Okay, so the first one, again, will start from during the last years of the period of the Gaonim. There was Shmuel HaNugget, who was a Talmud scholar who lived there in Spain. It was Muslim Spain. His son was actually killed, martyred in Spain, something that was not unusual because under Islam, there was much more persecution than one aware. He lived from 993 to 1055. Now, the first rabbi the person in that period of time from the Rishonim that we have of importance is Shlomo Ibn Gavriel. Now, He was more into philosophy and moralistic stuff. He wrote a number of poems which come into the Sephardic um, liturgy. Okay, but again, we really do not find somebody of a high level of learning yet at this time. 1050 to 1120 is Bachi ibn Hakuda. He is the author of Chayvus Levuvos. So when you pick up Chayvus Levuvos, you're looking at a work that is almost 1,000 years old. It's a work that's been accepted by Jews all over the world, not just Jews that's part of the world. It's a very interesting and nice work. It's somewhat philosophically organized, but as I mentioned, there's one particular gate within it, which is very important for Noahides, called Shar HaBetuchen. It deals with Betuchen means like faith, trust, but it's much more than just what the English word implies. It's a much more active type of trust. I very strongly recommend it for Noahides. Again, there's no mitzvah for Noahides to learn it, but it's something to know because it will help you in order to your spiritual type of side of your life as a Noahide, to understand what it means in Noahide. Just as a Jew, the idea of Petuchim applies to Noahide just as a Jew, that you have to have faith and trust in Hashem and what actually this really means in a practical level. Many other parts of Chavos Levuvos don't relate to Noahides directly, but this is something that pretty much all of it would a Noahide could get something out of it directly towards them, because this is, after all, what is the most important part for Noahide's life is actually what you're going to do, how you affect the world, what you're doing in this world, as opposed to what you read, what you learn. These things are not what's important for Noahide. What's important for Noahide is improving the world, making the world a better place, doing things for people, helping others, praying for others when they need it. You know, if you have the money, putting aside money for charity, to be able to give money for people who need it, to be able to do things in order to make the world a better place, and these in itself make you a better person. Okay. That's why, for example, learning Torah is not a commandment. It's not one of the commandments for Noahide. Learning Torah for Noahide is practical. You're supposed to be learning what you need in order to become a fulfilled Noahide, a full Noahide. Other than for a Jew, it is a commandment to learn, and so learning itself is a type of worship. Whereas for Noahide, learning is not a type of worship. It's actually a practical thing that's necessary for you to live, but it's not your focus. You need to learn in order to know what you should do, the kinds of things that how you should live. So, Chavos Levuvos, especially that chapter, is extremely important for Noahides because it will help you to understand what do we mean when you're supposed to have Betuchen in God, in Hashem. Okay, now continuing. After that, there's another rabbi who is important for a very interesting. It's the Magash. Rabbi Yosef Magash. He's from 1077 to 1141. Important to notice is that he is a teacher of the Rambam's father. Rambam learned from his father, and his father learned from the Magash. So this gives you an example of how people were involved in this chain of tradition of learning. They either had a teacher or their parents who had a teacher, and that's where these things come down to. Okay, so the Rebbe Magash, he lived from 1077 to 1141. Now, before the Rambam, there were two other people of importance that we should know about. One is Yehuda Halevi. He lived from 1080 to 1145. At this time, philosophical speculation was rampant in Muslim Spain, and of course, it was involved in the Jewish community there also. He wrote a work called Kuzari, which was defense of Judaism against Islam and Christianity. And it's considered one of the classical texts of Jewish philosophy and also moral teaching. It's a very interesting work. Okay, he lived from 1080 to 1145. Contemporaneous with him, living from 1089 to 1164, was Abraham ibn Ezra. Abraham ibn Ezra is one of the primary commentaries on the Torah and Nach. You will find him in almost all editions of the Torah, which have the commentaries around them, and many editions of Nach will have him in there also. Okay, he comes from this period of time in Spain. He also was philosophically inclined. Okay, Following that, in the 13th, we get to the 13th century, and of course, the 13th century is very important. Excuse me, the 12th century. We're in the 12th century now. The Rambam lived from 1135 to 1204. The Rambam is fundamentally in Sephardic lands the first and most important. Okay, it's they don't follow slavishly, except in Yemen. Yemen, I think, follow the Rambam specifically, but other Sephardic lands, they didn't follow him completely in everything. There are certain other things that disagreed, but essentially the Rambam is an extremely main source for Sephardim. And of course, in Ashkenaz also learn him, but we have, as we'll see later, different customs where we don't necessarily follow him. The Rambam wrote a number of important works. His philosophical work, Mari Nevuchim, The Guide for the Perplexed, of course, is well known. But he wrote a number of other works that are important, a commentary on the Mishnah. The two that we're going to discuss about a little bit more, going to come up more, is Mishnah Torah, which is written the laws concerning everything that appears in the Torah, whether they relate to us nowadays or they don't. So he has a lot of stuff on the sacrifices, for example, which are not things that we do today because there's no temple. But he also has a section on the Noahide laws. And that is one of the primary sources that are used when we look back in the Talmud and some of the other things. But we look at the Rambam also with his commentaries to understand a lot about the ideas of Noahide laws, fundamental. Also, another thing he wrote Sefer Mitzvahs, which is a compendium of the mitzvahs in the Torah. It's very hard to understand what his order was, but he wrote the 613 mitzvahs. And that's a work that is, of course, very important. Works on the mitzvahs are very important because when a book on the mitzvahs is basically telling you what a Jewish person is supposed to do. Okay. After the Rambam, in Gerona, which is I believe, in Castile. Not really, I can't remember which of there's Castile, Aragon. Anyways, Rabbeinu Yonah lived from 1180 to 1263. He's mostly known, although he has commentaries on the Talmud, which are very important, especially in the Tractate Bruchas. He's mostly known to the outside world from his work Shari Tshuva, the Gate of Repentance, which goes to repentance. Most of the stuff there is specifically for Jews, telling about different specific things of the Jew, which if you did this, what you're supposed to do to repent. But there are some sections which are of interest to Noahides. I think specifically to Andy, he talks about the four people who do not see the Shekhinah after they die, and he talks about certain things, these specific commandments that he talks about are very important. So it's a work that I can't recommend so much for Noahides because there's just so much of it which is not relating to any of the Noahide commands. So interest, but it's not very practical. But there are parts of it that are interesting, and maybe sometime I might figure out some way of at least teaching parts of it which are very much interest. Okay, following that, from 1194 to 1270 is the Ramban. Ramban now, let me mention something. The Rambam lived in Muslim Spain, but he lived under the Almohads. And so when they had their persecution where Jews had to either become Muslim or they would basically kill them, the Rambam fled to Egypt, and eventually he's buried in Tiberia. Okay? Basically, at this time, in Muslim Spain, we don't find any rabbi of any note whatsoever. Completely disappeared. The rabbis from then on that we mentioned, so Rabbeinu Yonah, that we mentioned, is from Christian Spain, and Christian Spain is expanding south in the Iberian Peninsula. So the Ramban lived in Aragon, one of the kingdoms of the kingdoms that existed in the Iberian Peninsula. And he lived from 1194 to 1270. Now, he has a number of commentaries on the Talmud. And he also is known more, for Noahides would know him more because he's one of the primary Bible Torah commentaries that there are. Every Mikvah Seudos will have him. Any Jewish book like ArtScroll, if you go there, they talk about the Torah, they'll be the Ramban, because he has a commentary. The Ramban is known for a number of interesting things. First of all, he's the first commentator on the Torah who starts to bring in Kabbalistic ideas. You will see them hinted at in many places. There's actually commentaries on the Ramban from a number of Kabbalists. who point out what he's saying and sort of try to explain exactly what it is that he's actually getting at. Okay, that's the Ramban that takes us to the end of the 13th century, 12th century, excuse me, 12th, 13th century. Now, in that time, there's also a few people that are important to remember. The first one I want to talk about, 1230 to 1300 or 1215 to 1280, we're not really sure, is a work called Sefer HaChinuch. This one is important to know for Noahides for a number of reasons. Sefer HaChinuch, like the Rambam, was written on the mitzvahs of the Torah, but what it differentiated it is he wrote it and organized it based on where the command is in which parsha of the week. So, for example, the first parsha of Genesis, he talks about being fruitful and multiply. Okay, the commandment there is for Jewish people to have children. Okay, now, and so it follows the weekly portions. What's important about that now, Jewish tradition had ascribed this to Arna Levi, who lived from 1215 to 1283, but some people dispute that and say it was written by somebody else who lived until around the year 1300. It's not really so important. What's important about this work is, while it's an interesting work in Jewish history, there is a significant commentary on it in the Achronim, which, as far as Noahide law is concerned, is extremely significant. This work is called Minchas Chinuch. We're going to come to the author of that later on, what it's about. But essentially, the Minchas Chinuch, when he goes through the Sefer Chinuch, he goes and explains the commandments, and he will, from time to time, explain if this applies to Noahides, and if it does apply to Noahides, how it does. Okay? So, for example, the first commandment of being fruitful and multiply, he points out that the Talmud is quite clear that this does not apply to Noahides. So there's no obligation for a Noahide to have children or to get married and have children. Okay? Whereas for a Jewish person, there is an obligation. And he mentions it there. Okay. But what's important is that if you're talking with somebody about Noahide laws and you've got a rabbi around, whatever, if he throws in that there's a Minchas Chinuch in some place like that, then you know you got somebody who knows what he's talking about. Okay. Those of you that look in Divine Code will find the Minchas Chinuch mentioned there from time to time. Okay, not just okay. It's one of those signs you can see you're talking to somebody who actually has spent the time to really delve into learning it as you're supposed to if you want to be able to talk about it. Okay, in general, most of the people who talk about Noahide laws are not on that kind of a level. Nice, sincere people, but you have to be careful. Okay, maybe when it comes to legal decisions, what to do, you have to be careful that the rabbi you're speaking to knows what he's talking about. As far as other things, giving, discussing, moralistic type of things in the parts of the week and stuff like that. That's a different type of thing. There is some kind of a problem. There might be commentaries that they shouldn't do, but essentially that's less of a problem. But when you're dealing with the laws itself, knowing what you're supposed to be doing, then you have to make sure that the source you're getting from is a rabbi who is learned, has learned the subjects. So if this guy doesn't know about the Minchas Chinuch and that it's something you should be looking at as far as certain laws, then this guy hasn't really done his homework. Okay, he may be nice, and he may have learned the Rambam and stuff like that, but it's not somebody that you should rely upon. Again, I'm going to try and avoid names, but there are a number of people out there who are very sincere, or even friends of mine, who will make pronouncements about different things in Noahide law who really don't know what they're talking about. Okay. Okay, so let's continue. During this time, also, there were two rabbis from Spain who are commentators on the Talmud. These commentaries on the Talmud are very, very important in that they've been very well accepted, and they're very well known as far as that's concerned. The first one is Rashba. He lived from 1235 to 1310, and the second one is Ritva from 1240 to 1320. Okay, they both have commentaries on the Talmud, similar to the way other Rishonim work, trying to explain simply what the Talmud is trying to say, and what's behind it. Me personally, I like the Ritva a little bit more. I like his succinct explanation. The Rashba is a little bit longer, The Ramban is also, a little bit longer than that. I like the succinct nature of the Ritva. It's very typically like a Rishon, just like Rashi is very succinct. Okay. After that, we get to what somebody who is, I believe, a Talmud from the Ramban, Bachya ben Usher. He wrote commentaries on the Torah specifically, the Beit Machai is called. And the significance about this is the first commentary on the Bible, general commentary on the Bible, where he includes Kabbalistic interpretations at the same time as other types. So he divides his interpretation. This is the simple meaning. This is the medrash, and then he'll say many times, and the Kabbalistic explanation is this. This again is a trend we see in Spain, moving away from philosophy for some very obvious reason. The philosophers this time after the Rambam were Aristotelian, Averroes, and what Ibn Ashad actually is his Islamic name follows them. And these people, their attachment to Judaism became very weak. In fact, many people who became well-known converts, Yeshua Larkey, were actually philosophers who abandoned Judaism for Christianity. So there was a general turning away from philosophy at that time. Not that there weren't important philosophers that we can see about, but there was an increase in Kabbalah. So you will find people like, for example, the Barbanel was both aware of philosophy, but it was also an understanding of Kabbalah also, becoming more and more like that. But philosophy became down, and the learning of who will become up. So you get the Rabbi Bachai in his commentary brings in Kabbalistic things. The next person is extremely important for Sephardim. His name is Reb David Avadirham, and of course his work is called Avadirham, and it is a list of laws basically outlining the custom in Sephardic lands. Okay, that's primarily what it is. Okay, after that we have the Ran. The Ran lived from 1290 to 1375. Now remember, we mentioned in North Africa there was the Rif, Al-Fasi, the Rif, wrote a work where he took from the Talmud and took out of the Talmud those things which were the final conclusions. Well, that wasn't good enough. Many people wrote commentaries on it. The first commentary of importance was the Ran. He wrote a commentary on the Rif, explaining it, sometimes adding halachas, sometimes doing other things, disagreeing, whatever, or explaining. Okay, so he's a primary commentary. So, for example, when you learn for halacha, for example, the koil that I learned was a koil that taught us to learn Jewish law. So we had a methodology. We would start in the Talmud. After the Talmud, we would go to certain people, and the Rif was one of them. With the commentaries, one of the commentaries was the Ran. We're going to start adding other people as we go along. The Rambam was also somebody that we learned to understand how the law is looked at, so we can understand how the final decisions are made according to our custom in Ashkenaz, for example, or some of it's far different. But the whole method is to understand, the legal traditions. So we'll learn Rashi and Tosfos to understand what the Talmud was trying to say, the simple Talmud, what it means, the final conclusion. Then we'll look in the Rif, we'll look in the Rambam, we'll look in all these sources which were geared towards understanding Jewish law. And that's the type of approach you're going to want from a rabbi who's teaching the Noahide laws. Somebody who looks at it from the halachic point of view. What is the law, what it is, and how we're supposed to understand how to do it. Okay, so that's the Ran. After that, we have a few people who are important. Rabbi Vidal from 1300 1370 wrote an important commentary on the Rambam. Remember, the Rambam is in Sephardic lands. Basically, that he is really the only type of the Shulchan Aruch, everything in one place. So the Maggid Mishnah is a commentary on it. 1340 to 1400 was Yosef of Barcelona, who wrote another comment. The Maggid Mishnah was on the Rambam. Yosef of Barcelona wrote a commentary on the Rif called Namika Yosef. So when you go in the Rif, you have two commentaries there, the Ran and the Namika Yosef. So you learn what says the Rif says, and then you see how the Ran comments on that, and you'll see how the Namika Yosef comments on it, and then you will come to a conclusion. You'll see the conclusion of how we're supposed to look at it, if there's a disagreement or an agreement, and then if it's a disagreement, you can have to look and see what happens later on, whether these are reconciled or how to deal with it. But this is the way the learning goes. Okay. Next person, 1326 to 1407, is the Devash. The Devash is known for his halachic responsa, an important person. He's one that I like because he wrote a specific response of dealing with the issue of Kabbalah, in which he defends it, even though he's not a Kabbalist himself. He defends it about an accusation that Kabbalah is like the Trinity. Trinity believes in 3 gods. Kabbalah believes in 10 gods. He gives an explanation how that's not true. It's a classic explanation by somebody who's not a Kabbalist, and he accepts it and points out, yes, that actually explains it, so that it's not 10 gods. Although you'll see all the scholars tell us that the Kabbalah believes in 10 gods. That's because they didn't read the Ravash and understand how people actually understood these things. So anyway, I'm in the Ravash. I mentioned it in Mika Yosef. Then we have in Spain the last 2 people at the time of the Rishonim. These were philosophers. Now, remember I talked about in Spain, we had the forced conversions in the end of the 14th century, but we also had we had forced debates multiple times in Spain. There's a famous debate in Barcelona where the Ramban took part, but there were others. There's a Tortosa in the 1400s, which we're going to talk about. One of the people, Yosef Albo, took part, and there were many others. And of course, there were the 4 sermons. The Jews were forced to listen to sermons. So there came out a number of works on the fundamentals of Jewish faith. So I'd like to mention 2. Okay, remember Rambam, one of the things Rambam wrote is commentary on the mission was called the 13 Fundamentals. It gets summarized in the Ani Mamin, which you'll find in a lot of Jewish Siddurim, but he came to the 13 Fundamentals. Not everybody agreed with it, and 2 works that are extremely important with regards to that. One is not as well known, but one is very well known, discusses it. And again, it's coming in the background of what's going on in Spain, where the forced conversions and having to actually deal with these types of issues in debates. This never occurred in Europe. So in Europe, we don't find philosophers in Europe. In Ashkenaz, there were no philosophers. In Ashkenaz, there were no works written on the principles of the faith. Okay, it's totally different approaches, which came because of the social situation there. These works were in Spain. We don't see them anywhere else. In fact, after the expulsion from Spain, we don't see works on philosophy at all written by any Jewish rabbis whatsoever. They disappear completely because it's specifically to the situation as it was in Spain. So these last 2, the first one is Chasdei Kreskes. Chasdei Kreskes was a philosopher. He was known halacha and Talmudic stuff. He wrote a work called Or Hashem, in which he said that there were actually 6 fundamentals, and he discusses it philosophical and whatever. Not important for that. He also wrote a work called Refutation of Christian Principles, which is what the English name is. I think in Hebrew it's called Bittul Das Noitzim, nullification of the principles of Christianity, basically what it is. Very small book. But again, it was written in the time because as an answer to the persecutions of specific types of persecutions that were going on in Christian Spain, where Jews were having to be sitting in on sermons and having to deal with forced disputations. Okay. Now, the second work we're going to talk about is from Yosef Albo. Yosef Albo took place, he lived from 1380 to 1444. He was one of those who was involved in the disputation Tortosa. It's a horrible situation. A number of rabbis were locked up in prison basically for weeks and forced into a debate. Okay, a number of them actually converted. They just couldn't take it anymore. They converted to get out of it. Okay, Yosef Albo didn't, but he did write a very important work in philosophy. On the fundamentals. I've been trying to. There's supposed to have been an English translation. It's just it's not possible to get hold of it. I've seen excerpts from it. I have the Hebrew version of it, and it's a very nice work. It's called Sefer Ikrim, the book of the fundamentals. He disagreed with the Rambam and says there's only 3 fundamentals in Judaism, but those things that Rambam says are fundamentals. He says, but you're required to believe them because they are derivative from these 3 fundamentals. So he doesn't essentially disagree with the Rambam, but disagree with the Rambam, but in practical terms, there's no disagreement, but in format, there's a disagreement. So again, after this time, there was an expulsion from Spain. I'm going to mention a couple rabbis later who were in Spain and were from the exiles of Spain. They're like a bridge between the two generations in the 15th century. Okay, so let's now go to. I want to take a break a couple of minutes. If you have any questions, and then we're going to go to the second center of Jewish, you know, tradition in Ashkenaz in Europe. So if you have any questions about any people we talked about, again, it's the reason for this history. The reason for this history is because you have to understand when I sit here, I'll talk about people who I know the same, Rabbi Blumenstiel, Rabbi Weiner. When we sit here, is because we are aware we are part of a chain that these things were not. We didn't just read the Talmud and decide what we're going to decide. We didn't read the Rambam and say, oh, that's what it is. We are aware of a vast literature of discussing from generation to generation the issues with it coming down to this time. And even though there are some differences I have, so for example, I'm a very ardent follower of Moshe Feinstein, and we will eventually get to why I believe Moshe Feinstein is the one that is the best one, both his approach and whatever. But the important thing is that all of us are coming from a approach to Noahide law that is the same. So I can sit and talk with Rabbi Blumenstiel on the phone for hours, and we'll discuss back and forth different things. And he knows where I'm coming from because our approach is 90+% the same. It's just we veer in the end because I followed Moshe and he has a different approach. Moshe Weiner, also the same thing. We've sat down and talked about issues. I've actually talked with him things in his book that I think he's wrong. We've discussed back and forth, but we have a love for each other because we're from Torah learning. Torah's people who learn these things, and that's what. There's a lot of people who aren't part of this who will give opinions, some right, some wrong. That is a problem, and that's what we're trying to get to, is understand where you should be going to get authoritative things, and then providing, the Noahide path is providing some things more. Now, I was asked a question in chat. Bob asked a question: how is the Rif different from the Mishnah? Well, the Rif is significantly different. First of all, the Mishnah is a collection of teachings from rabbis from before the second century, until the end of the second century. Okay, these are their simple opinions. These are eventually discussed in the Talmud. They're thrashed out. Okay, sometimes they're decisions that were in the Mishnah. They're called Baraisas, and they're compared to each other. The generation afterwards discusses the opinions of these Tanoim, and they come out through the Talmud with a discussion. You will come out almost always to a final decision. You said the law follows this view, or something like that, where you get to think, okay. The Rif, what he does is goes to the Talmud, and he goes to the final conclusions from the rabbis in the Talmud who had been discussing the Mishnah. Okay, and he might add in also something that became local customs, stuff like that. To develop things that the Talmud didn't really clarify. Because remember, the Talmud was living in a certain place, a certain sociological condition. The questions that a rabbi gets asked in one place could be different in other places. So, for example, one of the ways that the law develops is, remember, we talked about that the Torah gives authority to judges to make decisions. Okay, now they make decisions based on previous decisions made from rabbis in the Talmud, based on the Mishnah. Okay, but the social situation in Europe, where you were living in a Gentile majority country, as opposed when we were living in the Holy Land in Israel, where it was a Jewish majority country, there are different things. For example, what do you do on Shabbos? Okay, what can you ask a non-Jew to do on Shabbos? So again, eventually in Shulchan Aruch, we get a whole bunch of discussions about, but these come back from discussions that come later. Today, okay, you're not supposed to make a fire on Shabbos. What about turning on electricity? How do we interpret this for today? All these things come down from later on, discussing from things, development, and the authority that the rabbis have going back to the Torah to make decisions on these new things based on principles that have been handed down to us in our oral law, that this is how we decide things. Okay? And so that's what the Rif is much different, because he's basically The Rif is basically based off of the Talmud and not off the Mishnah. The Talmud is based off of the Mishnah. He's based off of that. Okay, Aaron, question.
Yes, I was at a show a couple of weeks ago, and one of the conversations that were going on between two learned Jewish men who were studying from one of the books was about Noahides and what you can ask them to do on Shabbos. And I began to listen, and one of the things that occurred is that I thought that there's a problem sometimes with asking Noahides to do certain things, a Jew asking a Noahide to do certain things on the Shabbos. And I said, in the Noahide faith, but then suddenly I was told that there is no such thing as a Noahide faith. There's only the Torah. That's
Okay,
it.
that
So
brings
I'm
up two things. Yeah, Aaron, let me try and answer that. That brings up two things. First, let's deal with the issue of Shabbos and Noahide. With regards to Shabbos and Noahide and any other non-Jews are basically the same. There are some pretty complex laws in the laws of Shabbos and Shulchan Aruch, again, based on the Talmud, but whatever, just to cut to the chase here, regarding the laws of Shabbos and non-Jews. So, for example, there's some chapters about what if you're in a business with a non-Jew. Let's say that me and Bob get together, we want to make a business, okay? And I can't tell Bob not to work on Shabbos, but it's our business. So what happens with the money that he makes on Shabbos? There's a whole chapter in Shulchan Aruch discussing that. It's very complicated. Bob and I would have to go to the rabbi and say, how are we going to work this out properly? Okay, that's very complicated. It's not something I want to talk about. Okay, so the idea of non-Jews working, and again, that actually comes about because Jews are starting to live with non-Jews. You're going to business, you have business. Well, what are you going to do with Shabbos? I can't tell this non-Jew not to work on Shabbos. He's allowed to work on Shabbos. There's nothing about him not working on Shabbos. Okay. Now, as far as the Noahides and faith, this is a discussion I really want to have at some time or another. It's really more appropriate when we talk about Noahides and religion, but I think I'll just bring it up a little bit now on, and we get to Noahides and religion, we'll talk about it more. Okay. There is no Noahide faith. There's no such thing with that. Okay. The best way to explain it is like this. What does it mean when we say somebody's a Jew? Do you know what it means to be a Jew? Where it comes from? Okay. The first time the word Jew is applied is in the book of Esther. Okay. And it's applied to Mordechai, who comes from the tribe of Benjamin. Okay. He was called a Jew because he was from those people who came from Judah who were exiled. The word Jew is like Judah. It's basically when you say somebody's Irish, you're saying, oh, he came from Ireland. When you say somebody's a Jew, okay, originally meant a Jew came from Judah. Later on, when the Jews came back to the land, the area was called Judea, again, a similar from Judah, called Judea. And in Greek, the people were called Jews. Why? Because they were people from Judea. Okay, so when you say somebody's a Jew, you are acknowledging that this person comes from Judea or Judah. Okay, that's where they come from. Just like when you say somebody's Irish, you're saying he comes from Ireland. When you say that somebody's a Jew, you're saying that that's where it comes from. Judaism, okay, is the religion of the Jews. Okay, the Jews are like a tribe. Okay, it's very tribally oriented. A person can enter a tribe. For example, we know, like for example, the American Indians. People would be adopted into Indian tribes. They weren't born Indian, but the Indians would adopt them into tribes. They would take Indian names. There's a lot of stories of people like that I read, where people joined an Indian tribe. They took an Indian name, and they lived lives as Indians. They were adopted into the tribe. They were treated as part of the members. That's what conversion is. You become part of the tribe. Okay, you get taken in. Okay, that's why they become a Jew, because they get taken into the tribe of the Judeans. Okay, if you want to look at it that way. Okay, Judaism is the religion of those people. Okay, that's why technically Noahide it's no Noahide religion. It's not Judaism because Judaism is a Jewish religion. Noahide is basically the Torah has a relationship to everybody. Okay, our tradition tells us exactly the laws that we're also for Noahides. This is Noahides are not part of a tribe. They are part of the human race. and Noahide applies for the human race. Now, if you want to say Noahidism is the religion of the human race, well, I don't like the word religion, but Christianity is a religion. Islam's a religion. It has a faith. Okay. Judaism is a tribal organization. You're either part of the tribe or you're not part of the tribe. If you're not part of the tribe, God obligates you in this. Okay. And that's really what it is. It's not really a religion. These are your obligations to God. God requires you to do certain things just because you're a human being and you're part of his creation. Jewish people are a special tribe. They have a tribal religion. Their religion is called Judaism. Okay, Noahide is not practicing Judaism. He's practicing that. And one of the significant problems of people coming out of Christianity that I find is they don't understand that Judaism is just what a Jew is supposed to be, but you're not a Jew. You're still a non-Jew. Okay, and so you don't practice Judaism. You practice what God wants for you as a non-Jew. And if you want to practice like a Jew, it's like you're saying, "Well, I want to be a member of the tribe, but I'm not." Okay, so we'll talk about this. This will become more and more an issue when we talk about Noahides and religion. We talk about, well, what's Noahide supposed to do? Because everybody has naturally some kind of a spirituality. We don't know where it comes from. We know from the oldest sources we found, people had beliefs in God. They had a belief in something beyond themselves. It's something that's just part of us naturally that we have. So there's always going to be this desire. That's why I need to have a discussion about Noahides and religion. But it's fundamentally important to understand that as a Noahide, you are not a Jew because you are not from, you know, you know, you cannot call yourself Irish because you don't come from Ireland. So you cannot call yourself a Jew because you don't come from Judea. That's not your homeland. That's not where you came from. Okay? It's a very important thing to understand what that actually means. Judaism is the religion of the Jews, and a Jew is somebody who came from Judea or was adopted into the tribe at some time. Okay, you probably haven't heard this before because most people don't think about it, but it's a discussion that comes out. It has many, many implications, by the way, in a lot of different areas. But you just have to, from our point of view, from Noahide, you have to remember, as a Noahide, you are not a Jew because you're not from those who came from Judea. So you're not a Jew. Okay, but as I put it very, very, very many times, a Noahide is actually an Orthodox non-Jew. Okay, you are following according to what God says for you to do. Those things that are commanded to you, just like an Orthodox Jew is somebody who's following those things that God commands of the Jewish people. That type of a paradigm is exactly what it is, with no difference. Okay, it's just exactly how a Noahide is supposed to live. We didn't have Noahides until very recently. So while there is a whole bunch of things, nobody really thought, well, how can a Noahide live a spiritual life? What are they supposed to do? We know what Jews are supposed to do because it's tied into the mitzvahs. Okay, but what's a Noahide supposed to do? So that's one thing we're going to develop very much in the Noahide path. I've given them, Dan knows, I've given a number of discussions about these things, and we've given them over and again. Very important that there is something that we can talk about in Noahide, path of life that is both spiritual and not just tied into some things. It's not just, as Christians, your whole worship was, evangelicals, you worshiped a book basically. Okay, you were Bible worshipers. You worshiped the Bible. That was it. Your whole thing was, Bible, Bible, Bible. And if you think about God every once in a while, that's sort of like a miracle because you're only thinking about what the Bible says. So it's different, and it's what my emphasis in Noahide path is to bring about that, not just what you're supposed to do, but also how you're supposed to live so that the Noahides can become something of admiration for within the Jewish community also. That they go, oh, this is really serious. This is, people who really, they understand the God of Israel and Hashem. Okay, Scotty.
So, Rabbi, you mentioned a book earlier that was also mentioned in the Divine Code. I'm sorry, I did not catch the name of it, but it discussed the Noahide laws in particular. Can you repeat the name of that book? And is this a book that Noahides need to get and study, or did you mention it because we need to find a rabbi that knows this book?
Okay, I think you're talking about Minchas Chinuch.
Yes.
Noahides should definitely not get it because overwhelmingly has nothing to do with them. It has to do with how Jews are supposed to do things. And quite frankly, its level, Jewish work, you can talk about on different levels of how much experience with learning you have to be able to open up that book and actually learn it. For example, I've mentioned your work, Chemdes Yisrael, which I've learned a lot of stuff. Okay, you have to be very capable and learned and have learned for quite a while to be able to open up that book and actually understand one paragraph from it, let alone to understand what the point is he's trying to get at. Okay, Minchas Chinuch is not as difficult as that. Okay, however, it is not easy. Okay, he references a lot of works in it. He'll say, and he doesn't spell out the whole book of what he's talking about. He just gives an acronym to something. And if you haven't learned anything, you have no clue what he's talking about. Okay, Minchas Chinuch, it is a fundamental for somebody who wants to be giving advice to Noahides. They have to learn Minchas Chinuch. They have to go through it, all those sections where he talks about Noahides, what he discusses from different sources. You have to go through that. Okay, you have to be aware from it. Okay, again, there's things that rabbis have to do in Noahides. It's just if Scotty, if you wanted to try and even if I wanted to teach you with it, which you're not allowed to learn anyways, but even let's ignoring that for the second. In order for you to get starting at your age to the level that you would actually be able to understand Minchas Chinuch, I would say it would probably take us about 20 years, if not more. Okay, that's why kids learn younger. I mentioned this many before. People don't understand why do boys go to yeshiva to learn. They go to yeshiva to learn in order to learn how they should learn, because once they've learned how to learn, then they can start really opening up, and the world opens up to them, and they understand. They can, really get it. Until you learn how to learn, you can't really do it. It's like it's a skill itself. It's like I know mathematics. Okay, you learn a whole bunch of stuff until you get to calculus. Until you get to calculus, you really don't know anything about mathematics. Once you get to calculus, all of a sudden the whole world starts to open up to you, a whole different world, and you can start going into different things. All these things start to make sense. Okay, the same thing is you go to yeshiva, you learn Rishon, you learn Rashi, Tosfos. Once you learn Rashi, Tosfos, you learn commentaries, Marshu, you learn all these kinds of things. Once you've learned all that stuff, then you're now capable to start learning and understanding what's going on. Okay, the Talmud is very difficult to understand. There's a logic to it. The Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, actually wrote a work on the logic of the Talmud, how to breaking it down. There's other works to that, but even that, until you get to understanding what's going on, it's very difficult. You could have discussions in the Talmud that go for a page, 2 pages about a view that's been rejected as far as halacha is concerned. But they're going to go into it and discuss it and all kinds of different things around it and spend the whole pages. You can get totally lost. It has nothing to do really with practically what's at the end. They're just, discussing to learn how to discuss, the logic involved. So it's a different thing. That's why I said with Dan said he read it. Yeah, reading doesn't mean you understand what it's reading. Is just reading. When we do things, when I learn something, I learn it. It means it's not just what the words say. I go into it and understand where he's coming from, what sources, other places were talked about the same types of things. So it's a little bit different. Okay, Aaron, how you doing?
Okay, I want to go back to something that I didn't get clarity on, and then this Minchas Chinuch thing. The thing is if we know we're not Jews, we're told constantly we're not Jews. We're constantly rebuffed in so many different ways. The interesting thing that I found is that trying to identify ourselves, we still don't have a concrete identification. Now, you gave me the closest thing I've ever heard just a little while ago, where you said Orthodox Noahides. Now, if I use that term, I'm sure I'm going to get beat up somewhere too. All right, so I'll stop that there. Now, if I'm talking to someone and they tell me, well, this is what a Noahide is supposed to do. First of all, I'm going to be looking for the fact, is he a Jewish person who studied in this particular way about what Noahides should do? And I would ask, what does the Minchas Chinuch say on this? And if he tells me I've never heard of that, I should walk away from him, is what you're saying.
Okay, let me clarify, okay? Because again, the Minchas was not written for Noahide laws. Now, if somebody asks you what you are, you say that you're a Noahide. That is a term that has been adopted by Noahides, but essentially what I'm saying is what a Noahide really means is that you're an Orthodox non-Jew. You are doing what a non-Jew is supposed to do. The term Noahide is just the term that's being used. I find that useful because it has a meaning. You want to use a term and define it in a way that has a meaning to a person who uses it, who can identify with what it is, realize what the status of it is, and also it makes sense. Okay, there's a lot of things that people say. Um, Somebody in chat referred to religion. What does the religion of Torah mean? The religion of the Torah is basically for the people. We're going to talk about Noahides and Torah. The Torah is basically for the Jewish people. Okay, flat out. There are very few things in the Torah which deal directly with Noahides. Okay, now there's a lot of reason to learn it. For example, learning Shara B'tucha teaches you Pab faith. If you read through the Tanakh, especially the books of Kings and stuff like that, the historical stuff, you see how God interacts with this world. So you see openly how God has interacted with this world. The book of Esther, you see how God in a hidden way interacts with this world. That's the whole thing the book of Esther is about, is how the word. So there's a lot of things in there that Noahides are going to get. When we talk about Noahides in Torah, I'm going to explain to you how as a Noahide, you should approach the Tanakh, and I'll explain to you how a Jew approaches the Tanakh, which is different, which is obviously different because you're not descendant of Abraham. When you read about Abraham, you're not talking about your grandfather. Okay, I'm a Levite, and my great grandfather was a Kohen. So when I read about Aaron, I'm talking about my grandfather. I read about Moshe, I'm talking about my uncle, and you're not don't have that type. You look at it differently. So as a Noahide, I'm going to try and teach you how you can look at it so you could appreciate it for what it is, and also it'll be a way that you should draw inspiration in a true manner from it. Okay, because there's a lot of stuff in there that yes, it was put together for Jewish people, but there's things that the whole world can get from it. Okay, there's a lot of there's different kinds of books, Ecclesiastes and Job. There's a lot of things that you get about from those books that are dealing with some very important issues. Okay, so there's a lot of things that the Noahides have from themselves as Noahides that they can actually look at it in a truthful manner, not faking themselves into thinking like the Christians do that it's talking about them, but in a truthful manner recognize and how they can draw inspiration from things that really happen. I mean, these people in the Tanakh, I have to tell you, they are real people. There are people walking around today who are descended from those people in Tanakh. The king Achav, who was the worst king in the Tanakh, there's his relatives, descendants, grandchildren walking around today on the face of the earth. Okay, there's lots of them. Okay, so these are real people. Okay, and these are real stories, and there are real. Besides the fact that it was written for the Jewish people to remind them of how Hashem related with them and what happened and His mercy. There's things that you can learn. I'll give you an example. The Northern Kingdom of Israel worshipped idols for hundreds of years, but God didn't. Even though He promised in the Torah and Leviticus and Deuteronomy that if they worship idols, He would wipe them out. He didn't wipe them out immediately. He waited and waited to see maybe they would repent. We see the nature of God, and Noah the same thing, how God is merciful. Even the people who go against His will, God, He's not sitting, Christianity gives the idea that God's waiting for you, and if you miss one little small thing in the commandment, He's going to zap you with lightning and send you to hell forever. That's not the God of the Torah. That's not the God of the Tanakh. And this is one of the things, again, we're going to talk about the Torah and Noahides, but there are many things in the Tanakh that Noahides should understand about what God is about, that even though the story is about the Jewish people, there's lessons that to be learned from it. And if you approach it as a Noahide, understanding that, you will gain much more from it, and you'll gain it in truth. You get the true lesson that's there for you. Okay? So I know how I got onto that rant, but anyways, that's, it's important to understand, you were born in a certain place. One of the things that B'tuchen is to understand, You were born in a certain place, in a certain family, in a certain place like that. Okay? There's mystical reasons, other reasons, whatever. But you were born in a certain place. So you always have to observe, Hashem put me here and where I am now. What is my purpose for being here? It's the same for a Jew, for a non-Jew. Everybody has the same question that they have to, what is my purpose in the world? Now, as a Noahide, your purpose, of course, is to make the world better. Me as a Jew, my purpose is to do God's commandments, do things what God wants from a Jewish person to do, which is somewhat different from Noahide. But Hashem wants something from you. He put you where you are for a reason, and you have to understand yourself by self, introspection, and then just work on it. Okay? Well, we got sidetracked with a lot of questions, so I didn't even get into Europe. I have to finish Europe, otherwise, the next time, whatever. And Europe is, of course, where I come from. I mean, my family came from Poland. What are we doing in Germany? Okay, no. Most of the Jews came from Poland, Russia. So how did we get to Poland, Russia? We're all here in Germany, right? But we left off our story in the 11th century. The Jews were in Germany. That's where the Jewish community was. Mainz, Speyer, Worms, in the middle of Germany, and then of course in France. So let's go to the story here. First, we have to go through the history. There's a lot of history that goes on during this period of time. Some of it you're familiar with, some of it's not. The first thing we want to talk about is one of the most major things, of course, that affected Jewish life in there, and was that there were pogroms and also the Crusades. The Crusades were also sometimes pogroms also. And I'm just going to mention the main ones. The first Crusade was in 1096. The major point of disaster for the Jewish people was in the Rhine-Danube area, which is in Germany. That was the center of Jewish life. And in fact, the three cities with the center of that was Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. In 1096, between Passover and Shavuos, the Crusaders went through the cities and total destruction. To the point that even today, in my community and in many communities, on the Sabbath, Shabbos, and these months, we say special poetry piyutim to remind us of the suffering and exile, specifically that time. On the 9th of Av, when we say kinnas, which are, special prayers about mourning and stuff like that, there is one specially about what happened during the crusade here, the destruction of these three cities. Okay, that was extremely important. It had a very disruptive effect. And again, Jewish communities existed. They still were in other places, but it was still a problem. Okay, one of the places where there's a problem at the same time was in England. In 1090, there was a pogrom in the city of York. The Jews went into a tower. I think it was a tower from the local bishop. The Christians outside tried to get in. They were breaking into it. All the Jews killed their children first and then killed themselves, rather than being forced to convert to Christianity. Very famous. And in fact, I heard from somebody who came from England that until today, the custom is not to spend the night in the city of York. You can visit York in the daytime, but not to spend the night in York. Okay. Now, that was the First Crusade. The Second Crusade, 1147, was basically, and the Third Crusade, 1180, was basically in France, where the problems had. After that, in 1298, there was a pogrom in various places in Germany. It was called the Rindfleisch massacres, 1298. We're going to get to that, mention it again, because one of the most important rabbis in Jewish legal history, halakha history, was killed during these massacres. Following that, there was another one, again in France, the Shepherd's Crusade in 1320. Okay, that was the Crusades, but besides that, there was constant expulsions. Jews were expelled from many, many countries. The reason usually was financial. What happened is the Jews were involved in, Jews were basically considered to be banks to the crown. Okay, they could borrow money because Jews were allowed to lend money on interest. So that was one of the professions that many Jews went into. And what happened is when the crown would have borrowed too much money that they couldn't pay anything back, they basically nullified all the debts and threw the Jews out of the country. This was very common in England and in France. So, for example, we'll talk about mentioned them. 1182 in France under King Philip Augustus, the Jews basically had outstayed their welcome. There was no more money to take, and the king just threw them out of France. In 1240 in England, there was a temporary expulsion, but the total expulsion was in 1290. Again, Edward I had borrowed as much money as he can get out of the Jews. There were really of no value to him anymore. He couldn't get any more money out of them, so they were expelled. Jews were not allowed back into England until under Cromwell, which is, I believe, in the 1500s, 1600s, after the Stuart monarchy. I don't remember exactly what it is. I could look it up, but basically we're talking somewhere around 1600. Until then they weren't allowed back in. France again in 1254 under Louis IX. France was basically a revolving door. Between 1304 and 1394, there were multiple expulsions under a couple of Charleses and a couple of Louises. It was basically a revolving door. The king rose, raised his, basically got into debt. When his debt got too high, he just expelled the Jews from there. Okay. We also see expulsions in the 15th century. Essentially, in 1496, the Jews were expelled. They'd already been expelled from France and England. They were eventually expelled from Germany, places in Germany, and they basically ended up migrating. This leads to the migration to the east, which is going to be started at the time of the Roman. They come into places like Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia, Poland, Lithuania, eventually Hungary, and places like that. They eventually do go there. This is basically spurred on because of being thrown out of most of the cities of Germany. Okay? So that's what's going on as far as that's concerned. Now, there are a few other things that went on. 1242, there was a trial in France under the king where the Talmud was put on trial. And of course, since the jury was rigged, Talmud lost. So in 1242, all the Talmuds in France were put together in a pile in Paris, and they were burnt. Okay, that led to an extreme. Basically, that was the end of Jewish learning in France. France proper. 1346 to 1353 was the Black Plague. We know the Jews were accused of having poisoned wells, and a lot of persecutions and pogroms occurred during that period of time. And this is basically what life was like in Europe for the Jewish people. It was very precarious. Persecutions on the level of stopping Torah learning were not as common, not as problematic as things got to be in Spain, certainly not as violent with Muslims, but the persecutions were constant, Jews having to flee from one place to another, uprooting, but they still were able to keep our tradition. We'll see the tradition as it goes on. The final thing I want to talk about is the blood libels. This was this quaint little thing that the non-Jews would find, Christians would find a dead child, and they would accuse Jews of killing him for the blood. The first known one was in Norwich in 1144. One of the results usually happening from somebody being murdered was that they became sainted. So the saint of Norwich, I don't remember what his name was, but he was sainted. Miracles were ascribed to him and stuff like that. So we can really pretty much see what those things are. Basically, England was very common. Gloucester in 1168. Blois in France was technically under the English at the time, I believe. 1171, Bury St. Edmunds. 1181, 1183 in Bristol. Germany started getting into it in 1235 in Fulda, a place in Germany. So it started spreading. It really started in England, going up to France, basically in English parts of France, and then it goes over to the empire. When we talk about Germany, we're talking about the Holy Roman Empire, which is what the name of Germany basically was at the time. 1255, Lincoln, a boy named Hugh of Lincoln. I remember his name. Saint Hugh. He was sainted because he was accused of Jews were accused of killing for his blood. It caused a number of Jews to be killed at the time. Each time there was a blood libel, a number of Jews would be killed in Germany. 1270 Alsace, 1283 in Oberwieselt. And the last one we have is in Trent, and I'm going to mention here at this period of time, although some that go later on, we'll get some more later on. In 1475 in Trent, I don't remember what the boy's name was, but he was also sainted. So we're talking about in Europe going through all these constantly expulsions, blood libels, all these things are going on at the same time. Jewish communities are able to function. They'll move around maybe from different places, from France, out of France to Germany, Germany meaning the Holy Roman Empire. They will be able to function. The tradition will be able to go on, but it's not easy until the final expulsion from places in Germany where the Jews start moving in mass to the east. So the center of Torah tradition ends up being in Poland for the Ashkenazim. It was basically a time where a lot of persecution. So let's go through some of these names that are the ones that are mostly important that you probably, many of them will have heard of. Some of you won't, but you should have heard of them. Important. So the time of Goyim again in Europe, as we mentioned, in Germany, in the empire, Charlemagne brought out from the Colonialist family 2 Mainz, and that was the starting of the community. But at the very end period, the leading person there was Rabbi Gershom. He was both a Talmudist and halachist, wrote things in halacha. He's very well known for a number of things. One of them is that he made for the Jews in Ashkenaz a number of decrees called tikkunas. One of them was that you're not allowed to marry more than one wife. Until that time, you were allowed to marry more than one wife. The Torah allows it. Jews living in Sephardic lands and the Muslims were allowed to have more than one wife. But in Europe, the prohibition for that came about in that time, and it's followed until today. He has a number of other ones, but that's the important one. The next person is not as well known, but he's important for a number of reasons. His name was Rabbi Eliezer. He lived somewhere around 1055. What makes him important is that he was Rashi's teacher. We have a chain here. Sometimes I haven't really discussed the chain of each person individually where he came from, but there is a chain. Rashi had a teacher, Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer's teacher was Rabbi Gershom. There's a train of tradition of learning that does exist here. I'm just bringing the main names, but these names are all part of this chain, excuse me. Okay. Then we get to Rashi from 1040 to 1105. Rashi basically is fundamental in all areas of Jewish learning, whether it has to do with the Talmud. He has commentaries on almost every single tractate of the Talmud. I think Nadurim is one that he doesn't have. I can't remember another. I think part of Psukim he doesn't have. Can't remember for sure what it is, but almost everything. In Jewish law, there are responses from him, and we're going to talk about a work called Machzavitchi, which brings his legal decisions. And for the biblical text, he has a commentary in all of Tanakh. His commentary is important. It's basically, we consider it really the first commentary on Tanakh. He basically tries to write the simple meaning of the text, although he does at times go off into midrashim that he finds interesting to understand the text. Basically, he's trying to understand the text. Rashi is fundamental. He lived in the area of what we call France now. Okay, now one of his students was Simcha Vitry. Vitry is also in France, and he wrote the Machzavitchi. The Machzavitchi is a book in 2 volumes. You can get it today. In it, it has the prayers to say throughout the year, and it has a number of Jewish laws referring to it, based on Rashi. He was one of Rashi's Talmud. Now, the generation after Rashi, who made commentaries on the Talmud from Ashkenaz, they were called the Balei Tosfos. Tosfos means additions. Their commentaries are either directly on questions regarding the text itself, contradictions being made with one text and another text, or questions about what Rashi says. The Balei Tosfos is not one person, it's multiple people that are brought together into a work called Tosfos. We're going to mention a few of the important ones right now. And the importance, again, of Rashi and Tosfos itself is like this. When a law is being discussed in the Talmud, okay, they explain it, but when it gets to the conclusion, so which is the conclusion, their explanations become very important because it helps us understand, well, the conclusion is according to we follow this rabbi. So what are the implications of it? Rashi and Tosfos will explain it. Okay, and that's why the Talmudic interpretations are important for the legal decision because it helps us understand what the text is. If you don't understand what the text is saying, simply what the text is about, it's very hard, difficult to understand what the law is about. Okay, so let's go through some of the main part of the Balei Tosfos. The first 2 ones were actually grandsons of Rashi. There are a number of grandsons of Rashi who are from the Tosfos, who are important, but I'm going to mention the 2 most important ones. First one is Rashbam. Again, Rashi only had daughters, so that's why he has grandsons. He didn't have sons; he has grandsons. His daughters married scholars, and their children were considered important. The Rashbam is important because, number one, he has a commentary on the Talmud. The Tractate Psuchim has his commentary on it, and there's other places where his commentaries. And also, his commentary on the Torah is a very important commentary. He, similar to his father, but even more, concentrated on the simple meaning of the text. He does not bring anything from Midrashim like that. He just concentrates on the simple meaning of the text. His brother, I believe, was Rabbeinu Tam. His name was Yaakov. And Rabbeinu Tam is probably the primary in the Bali Taisvis. You see, Rabbeinu Tam appears constantly about Taisvis. Rabbeinu Tam says this, Rabbeinu Tam says this. He's one of the primary Taisvis. And again, what he does is he says, what his grandfather says, discusses, agrees with, or discusses different situations, disagreements in the Talmud, and trying to clarify exactly what is the meaning of that. The next three are just interesting people who are important. Yehuda Sir Leon was an Balatosis who lived in France. He was involved politically. The Yechiel of Paris is very important. He lived from 1090 to 1268. When they had the disputation, the trial of the Talmud in Paris, Yechiel of Paris was one of the rabbis there who was defending the Talmud in this disputation. Okay, it was a done deal. He was going to lose, but anyways, he was there, and he appears constantly in Tosfos. A lot of times it'll say the Ri says, Rabbi Yechiel Paris. Okay, and finally, Rabbeinu Peretz was also from the Bali Tosfos. There's actually a collection of his teachings, the Tosfos of the Rabbeinu Peretz, that you can get, which is specifically his teachings. Okay, next a couple other people of interest. Not all of these people are major rabbis, but not so much of importance to hear. Rabbi Yontov of the city in France, which I cannot pronounce properly, so I'm not even going to try it. He happened to have been in York in 1190 when the pogrom occurred, and he was there in the tower, and he was the one who was involved with killing. They killed their own children and they killed themselves so that they shouldn't be forced to convert. Also at that time was Yosef Kara, not to be confused with Yosef Karo, who did the Shulchan Aruch. Yosef Kara lived from 1060 to 1135. He has a commentary on the Nach specifically. You'll find his commentaries a lot of times printed in what we call Mikras Gedolos, which has a lot of commentaries with it. His is one of the major commentaries which is printed with there. He comes from that period of time. Now, we mentioned that the Jews lived primarily, the Colonialist family was transplanted from Italy to Mainz in Germany. In this time, 12th century essentially, there arose a group that we refer to as the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the pious ones of Ashkenaz, not to be confused with the Hasidic movement later on. Ashkenaz was a pious movement there, somewhat influenced by Kabbalah, but it was somewhat short-lived, but very influential in the adoption of Jewish customs in Ashkenaz, even until today. Okay, the founder was Shmuel ben Kalonymus from the Kalonymus family, but more importantly was he wrote religious poetry, which we actually read on the night of Yom Kippur. Very, very inspirational work that he wrote. But his son is most important, Yehuda HaChassid, who lived in Speyer, and he wrote a very influential work, important about Sefer Hasidim. There are many people today who are descended from him around. My wife, for example, is a descendant of him. My children then. Sefer Hasidim was very important. It was a moralism. It's basically talking about customs of the way pious people acted, their customs. And these customs, in many times, become part of the custom of Ashkenaz and enter into the Jewish law, halacha, later on. Okay. He had a Talmud with Eliezer of Rokayach, who wrote the work also moralism with Rokayach. It's not as widely learned as Sefer Hasidim, but also very significant. Again, this was a movement of that introduced customs, pious customs, which became part of the customs of Germany, which again is part of what distinguishes Jews from Ashkenaz from the Jews of Sfard. These customs that come from the Ashkenaz were not known to people in the Sephardic lands. So they did not have that kind of an influence. Again, always following that basic principle that we follow the rabbis in the generation, what to do. So these customs started. One of the customs, for example, is very well known among Jewish people, is that a father-in-law and his son-in-law should not have the same name. So when people are looking for matches, the first thing is they ask is what the father-in-law's name. They shouldn't have the same name. People do certain things if they have like similar names but not the same name. So like say that somebody has two names, the other person has one name, but the one name is one of two. So they'll tell the person who has a second name, call yourself by the second name rather than the first, so you don't. There's various things, but essentially they're not to have the same name. There's a whole bunch of things from Rabbi Huda Chusad, which have become part of normative Ashkenaz custom, and eventually it's part of our halacha tradition. It doesn't apply to Noahides, by the way. Your father-in-law can have the same name as you. Don't worry about that. Okay. This question can only apply to the descendants of Rabbi Hillel, who said there's all kinds of things about it, but I've seen nowhere that it says the Noahides need to worry about anything Rabbi Hillel said. So, but it's just important to know that this is how Ashkenaz begins to separate us, make differences between them and Sephardic lands. Besides the different sociological things bring up different questions, it's also these kinds of things are making the uniqueness of Ashkenaz over Sephardi. Okay. Now, after that, we have a number of important rabbis as far as Jewish law is concerned. So we'll go through some of those. Rabbi Yitzchak Or Zariah, he wrote a work Or Zariah, which was a halacha compendium. There was no Shulchan Aruch, so people would write different things on Jewish law, just outlining what it is. His was an important one. Then we have Meyer Rottenberg from 1215 to 1293. He was a very big halachic authority in Germany. His influence was on the greater generation was very, very great. But unfortunately, his is a very sad story, but typical, letting you know of really what it was like. He was kidnapped by one of the local dukes, held in his prison, and the Jewish community was asked to raise money to ransom him. He wrote a letter to the community and told the community they should not ransom him. He did not want the local lords to get the idea that all they had to do was kidnap a rabbi and people would pay money for him. Now, he was one of the greatest rabbis at the time, but this would become a danger to all the Jewish rabbis because, hey, if they paid for him, say you had a lord who owed some money to somebody, had to pay it off. Oh, I'll just kidnap the local rabbi and say, okay, I'll give him back to you if you give me some money. So he said, no, absolutely no, under no condition should you do it. So he actually died in captivity and his body stayed there. A few years later, somebody bought the right to, get him out. And one of the things was that he was buried next to him. I can't remember his name. I can look it up. It has nothing to do with Noahides, by the way, but the story is very interesting. And he merited to be buried next to him because but again, this is again an example of a great rabbi, of course, very influential rabbi, but also the kinds of persecution that was going on during that time. The next two rabbis important, Rabbi Moshe Kusi from 1200 to 1260. His work he wrote a work called Sefer Mitzvahs Gula. Sefer Mitzvahs Gula means the big book of the mitzvahs. Again, the mitzvahs of the Torah is basically telling us what to do, so he explains what the mitzvahs. He has some differences with the Rambam as to what he considers part of the mitzvahs. Some things he disagrees, and there were disagreements about that. After that, there was this person living a little bit later who died in 1280, so somewhere about the same. He's Korbil, and he wrote Sefer Mitzvahs Kuten. He wrote the small book of the mitzvahs. Both of these are very influential and very important. They're quoted later on when it comes to halacha because they talk about the mitzvahs, and of course, again, mitzvahs that we can do today become part of the legal tradition. Following that, and a very significant, important rabbi is Mordechai ben Hillel. When you were in halacha, for example, when I was in Koilo, we were doing the Talmud, we were in certain commentaries, we were doing the Rif. We're going to come up to names of some more that we learned. And one of those was also the Mordechai. Is a commentary on the Talmud. And on the Talmud, he brings the law as it was practiced in Ashkenaz in Germany, how they did it. Okay. He died in 1298. He was murdered. Remember, I mentioned the Rindfleisch massacres, the pogroms of Rindfleisch in Germany. He was one of those people who were murdered. Okay? There were many rabbis we're going to find who were murdered during different times, just like there were many rabbis who were murdered in the Talmud. I haven't really mentioned some. It was not unusual for rabbis to be martyred. Okay, many of them were. Okay, that leads up to the Mordechai Ben Hillel. Okay, now we're going to go to two people who are extremely, extremely important. So if you want to remember names, these next two are going to be important because they're very key. The first one is Asher ben Yechiel. Asher ben Yechiel was from Germany, but he with his son, Yaakov, fled to Spain. They followed Ashkenaz customs. They followed Ashkenaz law. They ruled that way. But they had originally come from Germany. Rebbe Asher ben Yechiel wrote a commentary on the Talmud, which is called the Rush. Every Talmud has it. What it does, similar to the Rif, on the Talmud there, he discusses every single halacha that comes out, and being from Ashkenaz, based on Ashkenaz, how Ashkenaz understands it to be. Fundamentally, when you learn, for example, that's a koil for Jewish law, we learn halacha, Jewish law, we would learn the Talmud, we would learn the Rif, then we'd learn the Rush, and the Rambam. That's what we would learn. We learned the Mordechai also, and other things we might want to look into, but primarily those are the main important sources for learning halacha. The Rush was from Ashkenaz, and that was very important. There's actually a word called Pischei Rush, the short version of the Rush, which you can also find in the Talmud. It was that important. Now, in a sense, historically, his son was even more important. Son Yaakov wrote a work called the Turim. Turim means the columns. It's called the Arbiter of the Four Columns. The first column is called Orach Chaim, and that discusses all the laws that are applicable today that deal with daily life. Okay, the holidays, blessings, all the things that deal with daily life. That will become the first section when Yosef Karo makes a Shulchan Aruch. That's the first section of Shulchan Aruch. Yosef Karo takes Shulchan directly from here. The second section is called Yeridea. That deals with, for example, the laws of kashrus, how to make meat kosher and stuff like that, the laws of mixtures and stuff like that, certain types of laws that are the most important laws that rabbis have to deal with, that they get asked questions about. That's the most important daily laws. The third section is called Even Uezer. That deals with marriage laws, marriage, divorce, all kinds of things related to family life. And the fourth part is called Choshen Mishpat, which deals with business law. Okay? That four divisions, later on, Yosef Karo, when he makes his Shulchan Aruch, will base it on that and the paragraphs themselves. Now, what distinguishes the Turim and is different from the Rambam, for example, Mishnah Torah, is in two things. Number one, he deals only with the laws that are relevant for today. So he doesn't talk about sacrifices, where the Rambam talks about the sacrificial system. Okay? The Rambam bases it on mitzvahs of Torah, and he explains all the mitzvahs of Torah. That's the Mishnah Torah. But the Turim is based on Jewish law, what you need to know for today. What's actually, and also the nature of what is very interesting in that he doesn't just bring the law, he brings discussions of this is the view of this person, this is the view of this person, this is in this person. The Arbiturim was important, and it became, for the next couple hundred years, essentially, the text of Jewish law, and importantly, also it generated a number of very important commentaries. I will mention them now, but these people will actually come up later on because they're just significant rabbis. One was the commentary called the Beis Yosef. That's Yosef Karo, who we'll find out wrote the Shulchan Aruch later on. Another one's called the Bach, Beis Chodesh. He was a rabbi in Poland. We'll find out about him later. He was the father-in-law of the Taz, important commentary on Shulchan Aruch. Another one is the Darkei Moshe. Darkei Moshe was Moshe Israel's. He was the one who wrote glosses on the Shulchan Aruch and Yosef Karo to bring it more into line with the customs in Ashkenaz. So this was extremely important work. It was used as a basis for deciding halacha in Ashkenaz specifically for a number of generations. In fact, even when the Shulchan Aruch came out, there were some people who did not want to follow it. They wanted to follow the Arba Turim instead because it considered more relevant. Okay. Eventually, the Shulchan Aruch went over because after the Moshe Isserles added, we'll talk about the Shulchan Aruch later. But basically, that's the Arba Turim, a very important work. The final work from Ashkenaz, which is important, is the Maharil. Maharil wrote a work, interestingly named the Maharil. And the Maharil is actually a work, a compendium of the laws and customs of the Jews living in Ashkenaz. And that is a fundamental work. You find it quoted by Ashkenaz authorities in the later generations in glosses on the Shulchan Aruch and stuff like that, because that is what the custom was in Ashkenaz. Okay, I'm going to take a very quick break. We still got some more work to do. So unless you have a burning question that can't wait until I finish, I do want to finish here. There were two other areas we want to cover, Provence and Italy, which not very much there. And then I want to finish with the 15th century, covering a few people who were in Spain, who were from the exiles in Spain, who went out of Spain, who are basically not Rishonim, not really Achronim, but sort of a bridge. I want to finish that. And that's really where we want to end up today. So if there is a burning question, I will take it. Otherwise, let me just finish that and we'll take some more questions at the end. So a lot of history, a lot of interesting. Remember, there's certain names you should remember: the Rambam with Mishnah Torah. You should remember the Rosh, the Turim. These are very important. Rashi as far as biblical commentary, Tosfos as far as commentaries. Specific names are important. This will be found in the internet if you want. You can listen over the historical part. But the important part we're talking about is a chain. There's a chain of tradition that goes for the Sephardim, and at the expulsion from Spain in 1496, the center of Sephardic tradition moves to the east to the Ottoman Empire. I'm going to mention that in a minute. And then you have the centers in Ashkenaz, Germany, and France, which will, at the end of this period, also move east, which I'm going to mention at the end of this. Okay, so it's very important to know that we have this chain. The Rishonim ends with the move to the east based on the political situation that occurs, expulsion from Spain, causes a move to the east. That's the end of what we call the Rishonim in Spain. And in Europe itself, there's going to be expulsions from Germany that I already mentioned once, which makes the Jews go to Eastern Europe, where they are welcomed with open arms. We'll get to that one second. Okay, so Provence is southern France, very close to Spain, very close to France. So it's sort of a mixture of it. However, most of their work, in a sense, Provence is more similar to the Spanish situation than it is to the European situation. So let me just mention a few of the important people that I mentioned. In the early 11th century, there's something called Moshe Darshan. He was a Talmudist, but also he's important. Rashi mentions him a number of times in his commentary and his views on the biblical text. So he lived in Provence, southern France. The next one, 1120 to 1197, is the Ravid. The Ravid is very important because he's a commentary on the Mishnah Torah. When you are in the Mishnah Torah, even when you get into the Noahide laws, you see the Rambam says something, and then you see in funny letters there, it says Aleph Aleph, and then somebody writes something. Aleph Aleph means Avram Omer. His name was Avram, Ravid, Avram ben David. Avram Omer, that's the Ravid, and he has commentaries on the Rambam. Most of the time it's because he disagrees with what Rambam says. Okay, very important person to know for Noahides. Okay, after that there's another one who is a commentary on a different part of the Rambam. Sarachi Alevi, 1125 to 1186, wrote Sefer Habor. That's a commentary on Sefer Mitzvahs. The next three from Provence are somewhat well known. David Kimchi, better known as Radak, has a commentary on the Nach. My personal opinion is I love the Radak. His approach, his writing, it's a wonderful commentary. I really love that much more. Rashi, of course, is fundamental. You can't learn it without Rashi, but the Radak is very nice. I really like his commentary very much. Then is Menachem Meiri. Menachem Meiri wrote commentaries on the Talmud. What's important about Meiri is to understand his works were not published until the 20th century. So what makes him important is like this. His commentaries on the Talmud are very important, very interesting insights from Rishon. However, when it comes to halacha, people like the Chazon Ish says we need to ignore him. And the reason is very simple. When you look at Rashi or Tosfos or the Rambam or anybody who's writing about Jewish law, there's always people criticizing. For example, we just mentioned Mishnah Torah, the Ravid. When the Mishnah Torah says something, the Ravid will many times say, no, you're wrong. And we're going to come, there are commentaries on the Mishnah Torah who will either agree with them, will have commentaries, because there's a halachic process. There's nobody who's God, okay? Nobody whose word is that. There'll be people who always disagree with it, so either agree or point away. So there's a process that goes on. Tosfos says something, so there'll be arguments in the Achronim about Tosfos, what he meant, there's always there's a process in halacha where there's a give and take, okay? The Meiri was never subject to that. So if he has a view that is unique to the Meiri, according to the Chazon Ish and others, we don't accept it for halacha, and it affects. There are a number of things he writes about in his thing about Noahide laws, and because of that, the Meiri is basically to be ignored in what he says. Though he says something as far as the Talmud is very interesting, as far as halacha, he was never given the chance to be challenged as to whether there's really a basis for what he says or not. And once the Talmud of the Rishonim ends, the Rishonim don't have the power to challenge the Rishons. Okay? Because fundamentally the quality of the learning in the Rishonim is different to the Rishonim, there's no ability to challenge the Meiri anymore. And say, 1 second, that can't be right because of this, that, and the other thing. Because we don't have anybody on that level to talk with him as a peer. Okay, there's no more peers. The Tosfos had peers who attack him, other authorities. The Tosfos is like people arguing amongst themselves from the Chem. There were peers arguing with each other. That doesn't exist. When the Rishonim ends, that doesn't exist anymore. So we had nobody who could put that through that process. That's what Chazon says. We cannot take him because we don't know if his works have been printed. We don't know what the other Rishonim would have said. And since we don't know what the other Rishonim would have said, whether they would have pointed out where he's in error. So we can't take him, even though he's an issue. Okay. Again, you will find people that say the Meiri says this. I certainly don't follow it. There's some kind. I think Rabbi Blumenstiel mentions the controversy in his work. I'm not quite sure if in the Divine Code, if he mentions anything from the Meiri directly or not. He possibly could. Yet my view is I followed Moshe Feinstein, and Moshe Feinstein clearly does not follow the Meiri. Okay, in views which he had, and he has some very interesting views as far as learning Torah, as far as a lot of things that seem to be good, but because he's not part of our halachic tradition, you cannot rely on it. I wouldn't rely upon it. Okay. As far as okay, and the last one is Rambam, Levi ben Gershom. He was a philosopher, but he also wrote a Bible commentary called the Rambam. He was somewhat controversial, but his commentary on the Torah is very interesting. His approach actually has been somewhat influential to me as far as my learning of the text. When I use it as far as being a Catholic missionary, he concentrates on what kind of lessons we learn from the Torah. And at the end of every parsha, he says the lessons that you learn from it. And I find that very useful for me when I learn it, not just learning a simple reason from Rashi, but what kind of lessons we actually learn from different things, different stories, what kind of things we learn out of it. And so that's been very useful for me. That's the Rambam. Let's go to Italy. Italy, again, wasn't a big place for Torah learning, but there were a number of important people that were there. Right after the Gaonim, there was Nissim ben Yechiel, important in that he wrote a work called Sefer Orach. Sefer Orach is basically a dictionary of Aramaic. What happened is the Jews in the Middle East spoke Aramaic. That was the language, so the Talmud was in Aramaic. However, once they were exiled to Italy, Germany, Spain, they didn't speak Aramaic anymore. Some people spoke in the Islamic countries spoke Arabic, but Arabic, while it's a Semitic language similar to Aramaic, it's not Aramaic. And in Italy, they spoke Latin, other languages. In Germany, and they spoke German and French. Rashi was familiar with French. So Rashi actually in commentary, he mentions French words for things. He translates some of the French words. So There were words in the Talmud that people wouldn't understand what it meant. It's very hard to make commentaries if you didn't. So the Uruk was actually a translation from these Aramaic words into Hebrew. You can get it today. They translated different words in Aramaic that people didn't know what they meant, translated into Hebrew. Okay, what? The next two wrote form very similar. One's called the Medrash Leikach Toiv, and the other's the Medrash Seichel Tov. Now they're called Medrash, but they're a type of Medrash, but they're a movement from Medrash to the type of commentary that we're going to see in Rashi. So rather than being a Medrash like the Medrash Rabbis, it's like on each verse it gives like a somewhat of a commentary Medrash, but getting closer and closer to Pshat. So both of these are very similar type of approach, and they're very close to what eventually is going to be Rashi. It's like a stage getting to Rashi, moving from Medrash to Rashi commentaries. Okay, now the first one was Medrash Leikach Tov. Tovi ben Eliezer lived in the late 11th, early 12th century, and Menachem and Shlomo Medrash Seichel Tov, he was in the 12th century. Two other people from Italy are important. Menachem Recanati, his famous work of Recanati is off the biblical text. It's not printed with the regular text, but it's very well known. And the other one is the author work Shabili Halekit. Tzidkiah ben Haroifa was from 1230 to 1300. That is a compendium of Jewish law, very influential in the future. So that ends the Rishonim. I just want to spend 1 minute of the early Achronim. Now, what these are the 15th century people. What actually happened here, going from the Rishonim to Achronim, we're going to take the Achronim next month. Going to Rishonim, there were two events that occurred. Number one, as I mentioned before, in Spain, 1492, and in Portugal, 1496, the Jews from Spain, which had been a center of Torah learning for the Sephardim, ended, and the Jews were exiled. So what happened? Hashem prepared for them beforehand the Sultan, the Ottoman Turks. When the Sultan heard that the Jews were being expelled from Spain, he opened his arms and accepted any Jew who wanted to come to the Ottoman Empire, knowing that Jews were very productive and could help to the empire. And so the Jews came into the Ottoman Empire. That started, again, the rise of Torah learning and the center of Torah learning into the Ottoman Empire for the Sephardim. So we have there Syria, Iraq, all these areas would be settled by Jews. Again, Syria and Iraq already had people there, but the big people come there. In the Holy Land, especially in the city of Tzfas, Jews would be coming in from Spain to settle there, and they would settle in Turkey. And it would be the rise of Sephardic Judaism, and as an actual center of Torah and the tradition. The tradition moved east from Sephardic lands to Turkey and in the Holy Land. That's where it starts building up again after being basically dormant for hundreds of years. Okay, not that there weren't Jewish communities, that there were people who were rabbis, whatever, but not at the level that they're part of this. We can talk about the big major works. We will now start having major works and major important influential people coming from within the Ottoman Empire. The second thing is that we see the Jews were expelled from France and England. They went into the Holy Roman Empire, and even from German cities they were expelled. And when they expelled, they finally go to the east. In 1501, the king of Poland and Lithuania were basically the same country at one time, invited the Jews to come in and settle in Lithuania. So the Jews moved from Germany towards the east, the more eastern parts, so like Prussia, Bohemia, Moravia, those areas, Slovakia. Jews would go to there. They'd go into Poland, Ukraine, Russia. The movement started towards the east, so that the center of Torah learning, rather being in Germany as it was before, most of the people we talk about were in Germany or in France, has now moved to Poland. So my ancestors came from Poland. All the major Ashkenaz movements of today from Poland and Russia, Hungary, these areas there, East Europe, where did they come from? Because at the end of the time of Shlomo, the Jews were sent there. The quality, because of this massive movement, again, the quality, because of this political, the quality of learning obviously was going down. So they were no longer on the level of the Rishonim. So they're considered from then on the Achronim. Okay? Now, I'm just going to mention three people who bridge this. They were in Spain. They were among those exiles, and they went outside of Spain, and they lived into the 16th century. But still, we have to consider them probably at the end of that Tzliach. The first one is Yosef Yavitz. He lived from 1435 to 1507. He wrote a work called Or HaChaim. It's more philosophical, more attacking philosophy, really, than that. One of the things he wrote about the expulsion from Spain, and he made a very important commentary, which, as I mentioned earlier, philosophy was going out and Kabbalah was going in Spain because people learning philosophy sort of weakened their attachment to Torah learning. And he wrote that when it came to the expulsion from Spain, those who were philosophers, people of that nature, they stayed in Spain and converted. There were a number of very important figures in Spain who actually were high officials in the court of Ferdinand, who actually stayed in Spain and converted to Christianity. Whereas those who were more influenced from Kabbalah, simple faith in Hashem, they were the ones who left. Okay, an example of that is the Barbanel. Barbanel was, although he did write a philosophical work, defending the Rambam's 13 principles, he was also a Kabbalist. In his work, Yeshis Mashiach, he mentions Kabbalistic works, for example. So he was not a philosopher per se, and he went into exile. The Barbanel is very important. His life spans from 1437 to 1508. He came from the famous Barbanel family, who were royal officials for many generations. He is also a descendant of King David. Barbanel family were descendants of King David. And his most important work that we have now is his commentary on the Tanakh. His approach is much more philosophical than a commentary like Rashi, but it's a very important commentary on Tanakh. The final person I wanted to mention, Eliyahu Mizrahi. He was from 1450 to 1525. Again, he spans this period of time, ending from the Rishonim to the Ukrainian. He wrote a work called Mizrahi. It is a commentary on Rashi, a significant and very important commentary on Rashi's work. We have it today. People use it in order to understand what Rashi means. So basically, we have now come to the end of the Rishonim, getting into the beginning of the Rishonim. I will open it if there's any questions. Dan, if you see any questions that were written in or whatever. But again, if there are any questions, we can entertain them right now. Quiet. Okay.
I don't have any questions online, Rabbi.
Okay. The main thing we want to gain from this, again, is that we ended the 11th century where there had been at one time a central authority in one place in Babylonia. After the Seljuk Turks come in and end the situation there, the yeshivas closed and everything collapses basically there. The centers moved to two different places. One is Ashkenaz, which become the foundation of what we call Ashkenaz Judaism today. The other is Sfard, basically North Africa and Spain, which will become the center for Sephardic community. We have important figures in the Sephardic lands, Rambam, Ramban, and a number of other figures of the Rif who are important from there. Okay? When it comes after the expulsion from Spain, the center of Sephardic Judaism moves from there into the Ottoman Empire, where they were welcomed with open arms. Doesn't mean that they lived it was very nice living there. There were still persecutions as there was in most Muslims, but the Ottomans were much better and much freer, and there were less problems, and there was an ability that the community, the Sephardic Jews, can actually develop. In Ashkenaz, the same thing. The Jews lived there under severe persecution, but from generation to generation, from Rabbi Gershom to Rashi, the Tosfos, the Chassidic Ashkenaz, a vibrant Jewish community developing their own customs based on our system that we follow the rabbis at the time, leading up to eventually to the Rush and the Balaturim, which become very important for the period of time afterward, which is what we're living in. Basically, that's the important thing to understand. And within it, somewhere, a very small corner of this is the Noahide laws, which is, again, subject to discussions from time to time within this very tradition. Okay, that's all I have to say. It went a little bit longer because we had a lot of questions, but I did want to enter here. Next month, I'm going to try and finish. We got another 500 years to go. I barely made the 500 years now. I will see that 500 years actually gets divided into two sections, the early Achronim and the later Achronim. So I'm going to definitely finish the early Achronim. I really hope I can finish the whole thing, but there are a lot of...
In May, right, Rabbi? In May, not April. I'm
May,
not
right.
available
In
in
April, we're not going to have because Dan is not going to be available for us. I'm really going to try and do it, but I'm going to, again, I'm trying to bring out those names and things that are important that, as Noahides, if you're reading Divine Code, if you look at the bottom, you'll see names there that are going to start becoming familiar, and you can fit them in history where they come from, who these guys were, why they're actually so important that in Divine Code, for example, he mentions it. Or if you read Rabbi Blumenstill's book, if you see Rabbi Blumenstill talks about, and he brings these people up, why are these people so important that he's got to mention them? Well, they were important because they are part of this chain, and what their works are important. Not that many of the rabbis that I didn't mention aren't important. They are many very significant. But again, this is not a history lesson. This is geared toward a specific goal, so that you understand that the Noahide laws that the rabbis are going to talk about today are part of a tradition, just like the whole Jewish tradition of Jewish law. It's part of that. Okay, it's not something that somebody's making up and going back to. Oh, it just started a few years ago, 40, 50 years ago. People decided they wanted to, non-Jews left Christianity wanted to do, and somebody started coming up 40, 50 years from now. This is part of a long tradition. And importantly, what we're trying to say is, once you know what this is, you are going to be able to evaluate people who are talking about the subject. Okay, and I'm sure people are going to ask me questions about specific people. I'll try to be very kind to what I'm doing, but you'll be able to evaluate. So when you'll see what's the difference between Rabbi Weiner's book, Divine Code, and something you might hear from somebody else. Okay, you can tell the difference between somebody who really has spent his time learning it, but somebody has a superficial knowledge of just winging it, basically based on principles that he learned, but not really knowing specifically. So that's what's in essence, that's what we're trying to get at here. The goal being, of course, Noahides and rabbis, that Noahides should know how to understand rabbis and to deal with them and really get a feel of Judaism, what's going on in Jewish law, and sort of figure out how that relates to them, the people that they're going to be dealing with. Okay, I am finished. Unless I see a question coming up, I will stop my tape. Anything, Scotty? Everything's fine?
Oh, very interesting, Rabbi. Very important material for sure.
Okay. I will stop the tape now.